Arthroscopic anterior and posterior capsular augmentation with Gracilis allograft performed by Dr. Manava at the University of Rochester. Viewing from the anterior portal, a drill bit is inserted through the posterior portal and a pilot hole is drilled at the 6 o'clock position and more superior 9 o'clock position on the posterior glenoid surface. The 2.9 mm push lock anchor, already preloaded with Gracilis allograft, is inserted into the joint through the posterior portal and placed into the inferior pilot hole and secured with a mallet. The suture is then trimmed from the inferior end of the graft. The second push lock anchor, previously loaded with the opposite end of the graft, is then placed through the posterior cannula and placed into the superior pilot hole. Tension is applied, ensuring that no soft tissue from the graft obstructs the pilot hole while inserting the anchor. The suture is trimmed from the superior end of the graft. Taking care to avoid the graft, a punch is inserted through the posterior working portal to create a pilot hole at the posterior surface of the humeral head, posterior to the articular cartilage. The FiberLink suture at the apex of the graft is loaded onto a 4.75 mm swivel lock anchor and inserted into the humeral head. The tension of the capsular augmentation is set by the length of the graft. This completes the posterior portion of the capsular augmentation. The viewing angle is then switched to the posterior portal for the anterior capsular augmentation. Through the standard anterior portal, the first pilot hole is drilled in the anterior-inferior glenoid surface. This is repeated to create the second, more anterior pilot hole. The same steps as described previously for the posterior augmentation are repeated, with a second Gracilis allograft loaded onto 2 push lock anchors. The suture is trimmed from the inferior end of the graft after placing the first anchor into the inferior pilot hole. As before, the second push lock anchor, loaded with the opposite end of the graft, is placed into the more anterior pilot hole. The suture is then trimmed from the anterior end of the graft. A punch is then used to create a pilot hole in the anterior humeral head, opposite the 2 pilot holes placed on the anterior glenoid surface. The FiberLink suture, secured to the apex of the graft, is loaded onto a swivel lock anchor and placed into the anterior humeral head. The suture end is trimmed. This completes the anterior portion of the capsular augmentation.